By a show of hands, has anyone ever been disobedient? And what were the consequences of that disobedience? Well, I'll tell you a little story about me. Back in the late 70s, I was in middle school. And back then, in the 20th century, in case you didn't know, you could get spanked in school. And so I was talking in class one time, and the teacher told me several times to be quiet. Well, of course, I didn't listen. And so I got sent to the assistant principal's office. Now, I don't remember his name. I think maybe Mr. Cunningham, but I'm not sure. But I do remember his paddle. This thing was probably about, 4 inches thick, probably 3/4 to an inch thick, 4 inches wide, I meant to say, and 2.5 feet long, maybe. And it was square, so it'd go down, and towards the end, it would kind of go into an hourglass shape. Well, that's where he could hold on to the handle and get that leverage to make contact with your buttocks. But the main thing I remember about this paddle, at the top of it, the business end of it, there was a knot, probably, silver dollar size. And at the top of that knot were 2 holes drilled, and at the bottom of that knot were 2 holes drilled. Now, I don't know what the purpose of those holes were. I'm thinking it was for aerodynamic purposes. Because as he would go through the air with that thing, he wanted to create less drag so he could make full velocity contact with my behind. And so I got 4 swats with that thing, and they stung, let me tell you. Stung bad. Now, I'll finish the rest of that story later. We need to think about, would life be easier, or maybe not easier, but less stressful, if we weren't as disobedient as a people as we currently are? I mean, we've got some disobedience running around rampant. Would it make life a little bit less stressful if we weren't as disobedient? You can probably think of times in your life when you were disobedient, and when you were, what were the consequences of that? Did you hurt somebody's feelings? Was you a little disrespectful? Maybe the people you love, your grandparents, your parents, aunts, uncles, whatever. Maybe you've lost friends over this for some reason. I don't know. I don't know your story, but you do. You probably got examples going through your head now as to those times when you were a little bit disobedient to people and what did happen. Would it have been easier for you if you were obedient instead of disobedient? Well, now let's get into some biblical examples of disobedience and the consequences of those. I'm going to briefly touch on the story of Adam and Eve. I'm not going to read that. It's pretty lengthy, but I will put that down in the description of the verses I'm going to read. It's Genesis chapter 2, 15 through 17, and then the whole of chapter 3. Again, I'm going to put that in the description so you don't have to turn to that, but I will read from 2 Timothy here in a minute. So basically the story of Adam and Eve is God created Adam on the 6th day. Now, we don't know how long it was after Adam was created that Eve was created. 6 months, a year, 2 days, we don't know. The Bible doesn't tell us. But God puts Adam and Eve in this luscious garden. I mean, this thing, it had everything. It was a perfect environment. God told them, you can eat of everything in the garden. It's all you can eat buffet, basically. They probably had luscious blackberries over here, big old juicy orange tree over here. Probably had apple trees back here, and whatever. They just had it all. But he told them, of the one tree in the midst of the garden, that's the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, do not eat from that. For in the day you eat from that, you shall surely die. Well, what as people do we want? We want what we can't have, right? All of us are guilty of that. Well, what did they do? Here comes this slick little serpent crawling along, and it's the devil. But now, the devil's not going to come to you with horns and a little pitchfork and the pointed tail like you see in the cartoon. He's not going to do that. Because number one, that would be kind of comical. Number two, it might even scare you. The devil's going to come to you real slickly on the sly, like a con man. That's what the devil is. He's basically a con man. And what does he do? He tempts them into thinking they need this. They don't need it. They got all this other stuff. You got all this. But he tempts them into thinking, oh, that's the one thing you really need. And he tells them. So what does Eve do? She succumbs to the temptation. She bites the forbidden fruit. So then she calls Adam over. Hey, honey, come here. I got something for you. And of course, Adam comes over. Yeah, baby, what is it? Oh, she's got this naked woman standing in front of him, got this luscious fruit. He's like, oh, sure, baby. I'll take a bite of that. And they take a bite of that, and what happens? Well, they get kicked out of the Garden of Eden. And we'll go a little bit later on to see other consequences of that one little act of disobedience. Meanwhile, back at middle school. Now, once I got spanked at middle school, back then you had to take a note home to your parents. They didn't call them. We didn't have cell phones back then. You had to take a note home to have it signed by your parents, acknowledging that they knew you got punished in school for something. So I get home, my dad signs a note. Well, then what happens? I get spanked again. Okay, I got spanked in school for talking in class. Then I get spanked at home again for getting spanked in school. Look, I'm no lawyer, but I think that's double jeopardy. I got convicted of my crime, I served my sentence, I got punished, and now I'm getting punished again for the same crime. That's double jeopardy. I don't know. Again, I'm not a lawyer, but I should sue. But man, that's neither here nor there now. So there was a short-term consequence of that disobedience and a long-term consequence. Now the long-term, happened just to be about 6 hours later. But still, there was consequences involved with that little act of disobedience. Now let's see the long-term consequences of the biblical example of disobedience. Now, as I said in my introduction video, I normally would be reading out of the New King James Version, but today I'm going to read out of the English Standard Version. And this comes from 2 Timothy chapter 3, verses 1 through 6. But understand this, that in the last days there will come times of difficulty, for people will be lovers of self, lovers of money, proud, arrogant, abusive, disobedient to their parents, ungrateful, unholy, heartless, unappeasable, slanderous, without self-control, brutal, not loving good, treacherous, reckless, swollen with conceit, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, having the appearance of godliness, but denying its power. Avoid such people. So I'm sure Adam and Eve was thinking when they bit that forbidden fruit, just a little taste, one little taste. I'm sure they were thinking, what's the worst that could happen? Well, we see what the worst that can happen. You turn on your TV today in any big city, and probably small, Detroit, Chicago, Philadelphia, LA, Seattle, Dallas, Miami, DC, just turn it on and you'll see people being unappeasable, looting in the stores, heartless, killing people at ATMs for their money, carjacking people, going around shooting police officers. Lovers of self is what that one little bite of a forbidden fruit, when you had all the rest, that one little bite. But again, what harm could it do, right? And as Paul Harvey would say, now you know the rest of the story. Again, think of examples of what you can do to be a little less disobedient and a little more obedient. I'm sure you've got examples of what you could do. Now, what can we do? And the human race is a team effort, right? Because one little thing that somebody does, as we notice from the biting of the forbidden fruit, that affects a whole lot of other people. 6,000 years later, that effect of that one little bite is still happening upon everybody else. So you can think about not only the consequences of what's going to happen to you, but how is that going to affect other people. So what can we do as a team to kind of curb this disobedience and be a little more respectful and obedient where we should be? Well, we can educate people, right? I mean, that's what I'm doing now. I'm talking into this camera, talking to you people out there, that we need to do a little more thinking, maybe self-examination of how we are and how we could be better. Well, you can look into the Bible and read plain. There's more examples than those two I just read. So you look in the back of your Bible into the index and just look up the word disobedience and see how many scriptures come up talking about that. And you can go out and educate people. It doesn't need to be a 30-minute or an hour-long sermon. You can just talk to them for 5 or 6 minutes. Start with people you know, right? You ain't going to go up with some stranger and do this. But talk to people you know, in your family, in your circle of friends. So that's what we can do to kind of curb the disobedience. Now, is it going to make the world better overnight? Probably not. I'm not going to lie to you. It's not going to happen overnight. But how did you learn to run, right? You learned to run because you knew how to walk. How did you know how to walk? You knew how to walk because you knew how to crawl. So it's foundations. It's building upon foundations. You walk or you crawl before you walk before you run. So that's what we do. Just little steps is all it takes. So getting into the Word of God and read the effects of disobedience. And again, think in your own life, when you were obedient, how much easier it went. Now, sure, that pleasure of that forbidden fruit, I mean, it's easy to take the bite of the forbidden fruit, but then look at the consequences. So in the next video, I'm going to talk about obedience and the consequences/rewards of what happens when you're obedient. But for now, for this week, just go ahead and read some of the disobedient scriptures and the consequences, and just think about it. That's all I'm asking. You don't have to go out and change the world overnight. Like I said, just baby steps.